Welcome to Preservation Perspectives, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation podcast. Today, we're talking to Ira Matt, the ACHP's new director of the Office of Native American Affairs, or ONAA, as we call it internally. Ira has more than 22 years of historic preservation and cultural resources management experience at both the tribal and federal levels. He began working at the ACHP in 2015 as a program analyst in the Office of Federal Agency Programs and moved to ONAA in 2018. Ira has many accomplishments at the ACHP, including his work on traditional knowledge and early coordination with Indian tribes. Ira, we're happy to have you here with us today so viewers can get to know you and learn more about what you do. Let's dive right in. Tell us a little bit about your background and how in the world you ended up at the ACHP.
First off, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. But boy, I'll tell you, that question sounds like this background investigation is never going to end. Just kidding. This is kind of an open question. A lot to talk about there, but I'll try to keep it specific to what got me to the ACHP. A little foundation. I'm Salish, a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes from Western Montana. And I've spent most of my life on my reservation, and my professional career was working for my tribal people. And really, if I'm going to look back, it was my uncle who got me started working in the tribal government. To be honest, in general, he did whatever he could to keep me working. It was his way of keeping me out of trouble. But I got started as a wildland firefighter and all the components that go with that: fire investigation, prescribed fire, post-fire restoration work, which is huge, tree planting, thinning, firewood cutting. But it was alongside that he pushed me to learn more about, the plants and the trees, the waters, the springs, the trails, and the resources. And really that there was history and meaning inside my actions, a connectedness to my culture, and the ancestors that I needed to be aware of. Then at the same time, we'd be out hunting, fishing, talking to elders, and visiting cultural site locations. He brought my cultural awareness to a different level, and it's something that's really changed my life, broadly. And it was along this same time that the tribal historic preservation officer for my tribe asked me to start working in her office. She pushed me to study anthropology and archaeology at the University of Montana. And really, with my background in wilderness, my cultural awareness, and my willingness to pursue that education, placed me in a good position to grow and excel in the preservation office. So over the next dozen or so years, I continued to grow, learn from the elders, pushing to achieve their goals, and actively pursuing partnerships with agencies and universities and other programs. And I was fortunate because at that time, I had the opportunity to work alongside some of the all-time greats from my perspective. People like Marcia Pavlo, Francis Auld, Tony Incashola Jr., Mike Derglo Sr. And those first years in the program were really transformational for me. I had a depth to my knowledge, and I never knew they existed. And there was a point in time when the tribal council decided that it was time to appoint me as the THPO. And that's where things really changed. I went from chasing trails and pictographs and leading crews to do exciting things, right? Ice patch archaeology and surveying for culturally modified trees, to leading the tribe's preservation program and dealing with compliance in Section 106. And while I had tools in my toolbox, they weren't really good enough, I guess. Knowledge is key, but relationships were like a lock, and our knowledge wasn't always a universal fit. So as my field time dwindled and I transitioned into policy and program management, it was a shift that led me to acquire a degree in Indian law, something that I felt was necessary to bridge the cultural values of the tribal people with the regulatory processes that were so central to the concept of preservation and perpetuation of those values. Yeah, long answer so far, right? But I ended up, you asked how I got to the ACHP, it was through that PA development. It was through those 106 concerns, those usual suspects in historic preservation. But finally, I went back to my uncle. He pushed me to leave the reservation. He had basically told me I'd become too comfortable, and he was worried that I was going to end up complacent. I resisted, and basically that went along until he passed away. And it's too often the case. I finally reflected on his words and the wisdom behind them after that. And then fate kind of struck with a chance encounter at a NASPO conference, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, over lunch. It would be the case for Indian country. I had a chance encounter with ONAA's director, Valerie Hauser. We reflected on some of the issues I'd been raising to the advisory council. We chit-chatted a bit, and she pushed me to apply for a job. And to be honest, within about 2 months after that, I was living outside DC, and I was working for the Office of Federal Agency Programs. So kind of a long story there, but it all started with my uncle and everything that he had taught me and instructed me, and things just worked out the way they were meant to be.
I mean, that is such an interesting background, and really I find sort of a perfect blending of vocation, avocation, and just deep roots in your background. I'd like to probe a little bit more about a part of your experience at the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And certainly in your new role, you'll be working closely with those TIPOs, as we call them. So, having been one yourself and having seen what those offices are like and their operations, how do you feel that experience, one of many in your background, will help you in this new position?
Man, you got to get comfortable. So that's a big question, right? I'll keep it short for the sake of the viewers. But I guess, as you kind of just heard, me as a TIPO wasn't just me as a TIPO. That was built on so many things. The tribe's archaeologist, the resource advisor work I did for wildfire suppression, advising on how they should take into account all the resources in the limited decision making that they have, those emergency situations, and just being kind of tribal in general. And I tie all these together because really they're inseparable realities for me. Experiences that have helped me understand what my elder and former department head of the tribe used to refer to as our cultural truths. That's like the oral histories, the place name, the languages, and the knowledge our people have of the landscape. For my tribe, the Salish, Kalispe, Kasanka, what we know to be true. So from that foundation, I grew up in historic preservation, leading with our cultural truths as the primary evidence and incorporating other elements of Western science, right? Archaeology, geology, linguistics. But we were never looking to prove our truth. Rather, we were using like this variety of techniques to help us based on the circumstances and the situation. Because really our challenge, Indigenous people's challenge, is aligning our worldview and sense of being with a law and a regulatory process developed outside of our cultural construct. Really the bottom line, my background taught me that Section 106 can be sensitive to cultural needs and resources if it's pursued in a manner that promotes values other than simply project implementation. So if agencies and proponents, applicants to the 106 process, look to balance our projects with historic properties and to pursue consultation as an effective means of identifying collaborative paths forward, there can be success in 106, And to be fair, I've been fortunate enough to have had experience that have informed this perspective. Additionally, beyond my TIPO work, I've managed a tribal affairs program at the Department of Energy where I had to rely on other tribes to inform decision-making, facilitating that government-to-government interaction across a wide platform of concerns, cultural, natural, Superfund cleanup, treaty and reserved right considerations. It brought the resource concerns that I had dealt with on my tribe and had worked on to a regional aspect, and working with the Nez Perce, the Yakima, the Umatilla, and the Wanapum. Those were truly enriching times for me personally and professionally. And, it also led me to being a federal preservation officer. And I'm just touching on that briefly. I had taken my role as a THPO, managing that tribal program, learning those foundations. And now I was representing the agency, managing a national program, seeking to implement change and working with staff spread out across the states and territories, really overworked and underfunded. So I've gotten to experience it on a tribal and agency level and really at the advisory council. And so while my opinion wouldn't be worth a thing without my tribal background and experience, having existed at high levels within the federal agency and the ACHP as well has been truly helpful in being able to have a broad understanding of this. And, I do credit those cultural truths that I learned from my director, that thought process and the foundation I got from my uncle with bringing all of this together. So I know your question was angled at the TIPO, but that TIPO experience is part of this puzzle. And while it's the majority of what drives me, it's necessarily connected to all my other experiences.
And speaking of your experiences, if somehow you could, to follow up on that for briefly, if you could somehow advise a younger version of yourself, looking ahead and not really sure what you want to do when you grow up, perhaps like a lot of us still today, including myself, you've got tribal law in your background, you've got sort of deep cultural experience and ties to your people, of course, archaeology, conservation, anthropology. If you could advise a younger version of yourself, because we're always talking about how do we bring more young people in to the preservation world, in this big tent approach that we take, what would you say to a younger version of yourself, or perhaps to a young person watching or listening to this right now?
I guess get familiar with where you want to go. I somewhat walked through my life blindly, not preparing for the next step, which can work out. But I think for when you're looking at tribal youth, other indigenous youth, there's a lot of challenges out there. So prepare yourself as much as possible. Talk to people and understand what opportunities exist. There are a lot of opportunities out there. There's a lot of different ways that you can be involved with protecting your culture, with historic preservation. And as you grow and learn and talk to people, you'll find out what those are. I felt as if I was very reactive through time. I didn't get my law degree to prepare for something. I got it as a result of struggles that I was having. So I think that's one of the best things people can do. And it's one of the reasons, we'll probably touch on it later, but we have an MOU, a memorandum of agreement with Salish Kootenai College, a tribal college located on the Flathead Indian Reservation, to bring about these exact kinds of awareness to help share with them, and so they can see not just what's happening at the local level for them as tribal people, but at the regional level, the state level, the national level, because their voice is needed. And in so many ways, that future hasn't been written yet, because the role of tribal people and how it's going to change historic preservation, it's still being written. One of the most dynamic elements right now in historic preservation, at least from my perspective, in the way that they are pushing about, cultural landscapes, traditional knowledge, historic properties of religious cultural significance. So just do what you can to speak to the people out there and chart a path forward.
I think it's great advice. And, at this stage in your journey, I think it's a fair term to use with everything you've said. For those viewers who haven't heard of ONAA, have not heard of the Office of Native Affairs, tell us briefly, what does it do? And how does the ACHP assist Indian tribes and Native Hawaiians?
Well, I'm going to kind of combine those, right? I'm going to hit on what ONAA does as part of ACHP. And I think anytime I mention things that we're doing in here, it's collaborative across agencies. Our agencies are our offices within our agency. I know because as we were just interviewing for a position, the people I brought in to assist, OFAP, Office of General Counsel, we're all necessarily dependent on each other, because we all have that same mission, right? To elevate the tribal, Native Hawaiian, and indigenous concerns. And that's your summary line right there before I go into a lot of details here. Broadly stated, ONAA oversees initiatives, and we work closely with the ACHP's tribal or Native Hawaiian member to address critical issues that are brought to us by the tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations and other indigenous people. So we have that kind of that big picture approach, and we narrow it down a little bit. Big thing is we advise. That's kind of the heart of what we do. We're advising the chairman, the executive director, members such as yourself, and staff on policy matters, on historic preservation issues, everything from identification and evaluation to the development of agreement documents and program alternatives, incorporating traditional knowledge. I know you mentioned that earlier, to ancestral lands, climate change concerns, really making people aware that tribes have a broad array, a full spectrum. They're sovereign nations and they have an entire governmental structure. And for basically anything the advisory council is involved in, tribes have a concern, Native Hawaiians have a concern. And that's kind of the foundation of that federal tribal relationship. The chairman, it's him herself, is the official responsible for government to government consultation. But it's the Office of Native American Affairs who makes sure our agency broadly meets those government to government responsibilities and our trust obligations. We do that through policy recommendations, compliance with executive orders, and really just advising staff and federal agencies. We do a lot of technical assistance underneath that, whether it's just getting through the Section 106 process. And it can be anybody who contacts us about how to work with tribes. It can be tribes wanting to work in the process. Federal agencies, SHPOs or TIPOs, the State Historic Preservation Officers, or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. We're here to try to utilize our experience and knowledge and help people walk through their concerns that they're having. And we achieve this through guidance documents and trainings as well, information papers, and participation in a lot of administration initiatives. And that last one I just hit on is kind of big. We try our best to work with feds, states, intertribal organizations, because so much of the 106 process doesn't involve the ACHP. Most undertakings we're not there on. And with such a small agency, we have to be selective on where we do get involved. So we do a lot of work groups, sacred sites work groups, tribal and treaty rights, the White House Council on Native American Affairs. And really, we're doing all this to help educate those agencies at that foundational level so that they're able to implement practices and procedures to account for those concerns of Indian tribes and Native Hawaiians as they go about their business. And one other one that I just want to hit on again, we mentioned it earlier, is the Native Youth Working Group. We really are proud of the fact that we're able to concentrate efforts on just educating youth. And that's our proactive effort, right? We're trying to help the youth be aware of everything. So when they come up, they're not making the same mistakes that people are making now. They're not having to learn on the fly in the same way that other professionals are still trying to, address some of the issues. So really the goal of ONAA is to provide a diverse approach to addressing historic preservation concerns, direct assistance, education, training, and a variety of different mechanisms. And that's one thing I want to say to anybody out there still listening to me. If you have issues, if you have ideas, feel free to share them with us, because we're here to really elevate your voice. And we can't generate all the ideas, but we also can't speak for you. We're here to try to, serve on your behalf. And that's just kind of my plug to anybody out there. If they've ever said, I wish the ACHP would, well, let me know about it and I'll see what I can do to help you.
You touch on a number of contemporary issues there, and also potential, frankly, public policy concerns that could be coming down the pipe. That offers a good segue to my next question, which is, what are some of your goals as director, of the office, and what are some of the major projects that you're working on these days?
Those go hand in hand. So I'm kind of glad you asked that together, because I guess my goals as director, first off, I'll get back to some more of this in a bit, but I'm building on what was here ahead of me. And that's because Valerie Hauser, the prior director, she worked hard. She had a vision, but she was inclusive. I've been here. William Dancingfeather has been here. We've been informing this program. And so the direction it is a reflection of where I want to take it already. And of course, we're going to have to meet the needs that come up, the challenges. And that is identified in some of our current projects. First one, I'll do climate change. It's an administration priority. It's a reality out there on the ground. And the ACHP itself has a task force, but we have our own specific tribal and NHO plan. And that's just something that we're looking to align, of course, with the ACHP's task force, but also the White House Council on Native American Affairs Climate Adaptation Subcommittee. We want to create some consistency in our actions while also addressing the concerns of the tribes. And that kind of falls hand in hand with Indigenous knowledge. The ACHP, when we talk about our traditional knowledge initiative, we've been working on it for years. This administration has a work group that's focusing on it. And I know the ACHP, the Native American Affairs Committee, has asked us to pursue that more directly. And that's just flat out foundational for Indian tribes, Native Hawaiians, and Indigenous people, because that's what they're bringing. So much of their information is that Indigenous knowledge. And we have information papers, but we're working with the administration on a government-wide guidance right now through their ITEK, their Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge Work Group. And the ACHP is going to follow that. We're going to have our own guidance for the Section 106 process. We're going to try to find some best practices and hopefully have some training development. I'll close this out real quick with the projects. I mean, I mentioned the White House Council on Native American Affairs. There's a lot going on there. A number of committees, subcommittees, but we're on the tribal treaty rights, MOU. We're trying to implement more treaty and reserved rights considerations, guidance documents, incorporation of language into policy. So that's an active group, great leadership in that one. We're also working on a sacred sites MOU work group where we're trying to do the same thing and bring about those concerns of sacred sites, which are identified under a separate executive order. But sacred sites can also be historic properties. And sacred sites are not just artifacts, and these can be natural resources as well. So what we've been doing, that group's been doing, is taking that more holistic approach to try to find a way to advance those concerns of Indian tribes and Native Hawaiians. And the last thing I'll say for the projects is it's getting close to done. Really excited about it. It's a training that the ACHP has been working on with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Justice. People have seen it before. It's called Working Effectively with Tribal Governments. It's been retooled to address, a lot of the new information that's come out. But it's training that's going to advance the knowledge of Indian tribes and tribal governments, the trust responsibility, and the federal tribal relationship. That's going to get unveiled in 2022 here sometime. And that's a really great tool, not only for feds, but if that goes open to the public to help create some of that awareness, it's just not quite there in mainstream culture. So those are projects. I do want to hit on the goals of director real quick. I'll keep this broad. I'm going to say empowering, right? I want to empower tribes to have a greater role in the 106 process. And that's a big overarching statement. Transparency is a big component of that for me, because for the actions that the ACHP is taking at our level, at that policy, at that guidance level, we need to make sure they're aware. And that's something we have done and something we plan on doing more. And really, the goal, to be able to facilitate better relationships between federal agencies and Indigenous people is to continue to hit on Indigenous knowledge and to make sure that we're able to not only meet the needs of the tribal people, Native Hawaiians out there, but we want to work with the feds more. because they have to receive this information and they have to be able to facilitate it. And having been on both sides, I can tell you a lot of times you're kind of dealing with that square peg, round hole situation where two things just aren't consistent. And that's our job at the ACHP, is to be that conduit, to help facilitate that. Directly for Indian tribes, I'm getting out of my lane a little bit saying some of these, but I want to support more of those 101D5 agreements, those alternate procedures developed by tribes that allow them to tailor the Section 106 process on tribal lands. To date, that's only been achieved twice out of the 574 tribes. But with the growth of tribes in the preservation process, the time seems right to further develop those. And for the tribes who aren't ready to kind of take that big leap, more program alternatives, the ability for agencies and tribes to seek to alter that 106 process on tribal lands in more of a case-by-case scenario, whether it's, a BIA or a Federal Highways Administration. And it's not simply to expedite the agency or applicant needs, but to move those in a way that reinforces sovereignty by clarifying the tribe's role in the process, possibly giving deference to tribal decision-making, and creating a more tailored identification process, so that kind of my theme throughout this whole component with traditional knowledge and tribal values, can that identification process seek to move beyond what has been traditional, historic, architecture and archaeology, and move into more of the sites that have intangible values that are imbued in the landscape. So those are not easy lifts, but those are things I think the prior director has set a great platform for us to build toward in the future. So kind of hopefully that hits on your questions there.
Oh, it seems like it not only does, but it seems like you've got plenty of work ahead in the office. But I wasn't going to ask you about the 106 process, but you were right to raise it a number of times here during our discussion. And so, briefly, imagine we have a viewer or a listener who doesn't know anything about 106, maybe never heard of it. Could you briefly explain, why is the 106 process important to tribes, and kind of what's their role? Like, what does this look like?
Well, the 106 is really, that's always characterized as a stop, look, listen. It creates informed decision making, so that when projects are happening that are, either funded or undertaken by the government or permitted, that they are fully informed in what they're doing. What are you going to impact? And can you possibly avoid that impact and minimize it, or if necessary, and it has importance to people, mitigate it by trying to find ways to, replacing value is not really it, but trying to find ways to help, bolster the significance of it in another way. So what this does for Indian tribes, and this comes through the 92 amendments, is it made those tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations both statutory parties to the process, meaning they are by right, they get to be involved if any of their sites may be affected. And what that is just showing is, of course, the United States, the islands out there, these are all inhabited by indigenous people since time immemorial. There is not a project happening that is not happening on ancestral lands important to probably a number of groups of people. So this places them in a position to inform decision making. And it's important to realize, 106, it's procedural. It doesn't dictate an outcome, but it does ask that the agencies make a reasonable and good faith effort. And that's what the ACHP is here to do, is to make sure that early on, they're consulting with tribes to say, do you have concerns out here? They're talking with Native Hawaiians to ask if they have information about resources that they can work into project planning and possibly avoid in that arena. And throughout it, when they're looking about how to document whether or not it meets some sort of eligibility standards that exist within our legal framework, they're coordinating so that this isn't done outside of that tribal or Native Hawaiian involvement, because that has been some of the historical issues. And I kind of mentioned it early on. The law developed in 1966 that time didn't necessarily account for Indian tribes, Native Hawaiians, and other indigenous people. And to the best of its ability so far, it's been amended, but it's still developed outside, like I said, from that cultural construct of tribal people. And so it's not quite consistent. But what it allows is that voice, that active voice to be involved. And some of the greatest opportunity is at the agency level, because they have the ability to go above and beyond the regulations. The regulations are the floor. And so when tribes want to work with them, if an agency can, they can make those changes. They can accommodate. They can alter projects. They can not conduct projects. They can mitigate in ways that are going to be beneficial to the tribe. So it creates that arena of opportunity and interaction. And it doesn't always go well. Most of the times it probably doesn't go well, because you're talking about development and you're talking about preservation on the other side of it. But right now it's the tool that we have, and we're going to do what we can to continue to bolster the successes. And then for some of those areas out there, for some of those arenas that haven't been fully explored, like program alternatives that benefit tribes, we're going to push to see if there's unexplored territory that can be a benefit to tribes and Native Hawaiians and other indigenous people out there.
Okay, well, you've passed the test so far, but let's leave viewers with a call to action. Where do they go from here to get more information about your work, to get involved, and where can they get information at your office?
Oh, it's all on this magical place called the internet. Heard about it, seen stories. No, achp.gov. I think that's the most direct way to go, is to our website. From there, you can get to our Office of Native American Affairs. We have a number of different documents. It's all on there: guidance documents, information papers, policy. That's the first step in our transparency. It's all there and available for you. And we have our contact information. Right now, we're a team of two, myself and Bill Dancing Feather. We're hiring a third person, and we're available. Email, you can call us, invite us to meetings. Like, you could write us a letter if you wanted to. We make sure that in whatever mechanism that you can contact us, we will be responsive to you at our earliest convenience. So achp.gov is the location to go to, and then you'll look for our tab underneath there, and you can find all the information you need.
I think that's a great point here to wrap up. Thank you to Ira Matt for being my guest today. Be sure to follow the ACHP on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube to keep up with the latest in historic preservation news. I'm Luke Nichter. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.